it's been very difficult in the past for people to transition, and it's sort of like a tough love. Well, like I had to do it. I had a rough road, so you need to have a rough road kind of situation. The other patient, she was transitioning to a male, and she, had unfortunately an estrangement from her mother, and her mother died, and that was, very painful for her and him. Sorry, and that's the other thing is that, it's really hard. I flounder a lot with the pronouns, and I feel so bad, and I'm, trying to, keep everything straight, has been one of the challenging things I think of in my counseling. That's probably been like the hardest part for me. And but going back to this patient, he was not able to reconcile with his mother, before the mother passed away, and that was very, very painful. And this patient, unfortunately, didn't, was an only child, so that support system is cut off. But that individual was able to create their own social system and support system. So I know that there are a lot of psychosocial barriers. I think that, there are concerns about stigma, and that's a barrier to healthcare. And I know that that's one of the things that people are really, really concerned about. I think that we're very, very lucky that we have a very welcoming community, that we have specific healthcare resources that are identifiable, easy to refer to, and patients use those resources. So our experience, I think, is very different than other areas of the country.
And it's not.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, and it's not like they're only seeing you as a provider. It sounds like they have a pretty well-rounded provider system at where you're located.
Yes, they do. It's very robust. Yes.
Yeah. And apart from, could you go more into different concerns that your patients have had to cancer care that had to do with being transgender or differed because they're transgender?
Yes. So my patient that was transitioning to male had a family history of breast and ovarian cancer, and there is, a concern that with testosterone exposure that it could potentially increase the risk for uterine and ovarian cancer. And he did not want to go to the waiting room that our gynecologist, who works exclusively with our clinic, he did not want to go to that waiting room. And it was a little bit frustrating because, I couldn't really understand, because men go with their partner to the gynecologist all the time if someone is pregnant. And so, there would not really be any way, in the waiting room to, it really honestly, there wouldn't be any, I couldn't quite get what the reasoning behind that was. And he just wouldn't, I kept, asking, and I would rephrase the question and, why, is this, such a concern for you? And I rephrased it in multiple ways, and, he just would not open up and elaborate. And, but he just did not want to go and sit in a gynecology waiting room where there were other women there. And so, that was pretty frustrating because we don't really have available to us in the cancer center, which is where he could be seen by this particular provider, but we didn't have the equipment to do a pelvic exam. We had exam tables, but we didn't have a speculum. It's just not completely set up in the way that it would take the best care of him, and so that was a little bit frustrating.
Yeah. And have you found that your patients are comfortable talking about those sensitive, like, body parts, like your trans male patients talking about breasts and ovaries and uteruses
Yeah,
and
they've
your
been very very comfortable. For example, I saw a young man yesterday, and he had been on testosterone for about 6 months, and he was very open about talking about changes to his body habitus, changes in fat distribution, and he had to go buy new shirts because his neck had gotten broader and his shoulders had gotten broader, and he definitely had noticed changes in his weight, changes in the way that the fat was distributed on his body habitus. And we talked about surgery, and he was quite open about the limitations, that it's not something that he is sure that he'll be able to afford. He also has some very significant concerns about functionality after that type of surgery. And
Mhm.
I asked him about reproduction, and whether he was interested in um, freezing eggs or embryos, and when he was quite honest, he said, I looked into that, but it was so expensive that that's just not something that I'm able to consider. And he basically just said, that will be something that my partner will carry the pregnancy if we do decide to have children. And he also said that this made him a little bit more open to adoption, because it would probably be cost prohibitive for him to have any biological children. So
Yeah.
I think that there's not as much of a rush to consider surgery. I think that the patients that I have seen, they're very comfortable in taking things in a stepwise fashion, and they don't feel that there's a deadline for them to consider surgery, and that that they feel that this is a process and that it's a gradual process. That has been my impression, from the patients that I've seen.
Yeah. And you mentioned, like, costs of fertility preservation and such. Have you ever found that a patient has wanted to have a mutation to have things covered by insurance,
Yes.
like the surgeries?
Yeah. We see that, of course, more frequently in women who are transitioning to men. They want to have the mutation because then, there's coverage, for those types of surgeries. Of course, it's not going to be, it'll be a very different type of, surgery.
Hmm.
So, yes, that has been something that we have, run into.
Okay. And how do you navigate those conversations?
Well, I think it's important to talk about them just as you would talk about them to any other patient, and I think you just have to be upfront and as transparent as possible. Certainly for a patient that's transitioning to male, if they have a BRCA mutation or a CHEK2 mutation or any other gene that causes them to be at increased risk for developing breast cancer, risk-reducing bilateral mastectomy with or without reconstruction is definitely an option. And I don't think that individuals who are transitioning to a different gender should be denied those resources or those opportunities just because of their medical choices.
Right. Yeah. And what has been the age range for your patients?
The age range of our